There is something unsettling about hearing a beloved actor speak calmly about his own funeral, not with fear or despair, but with clarity, humor, and a quiet sense of control. When Michael J. Fox recently revealed that there are certain people he would rather not see standing at his final goodbye, the headline sounded provocative, even dramatic. Yet the truth behind those words is far more intimate and far more human than any shock-driven narrative could suggest. This was not about grudges or ego. It was about a man who has lived for more than 3 decades with a progressive disease, learning exactly what matters when everything else slowly falls away. At 64, Fox is no longer the restless teenager racing through time in a red vest, nor the sharp-tongued political prodigy who once dominated television screens. He is a man who wakes up each day negotiating with his own body, measuring hours not by ambition, but by stability. Parkinson's disease does that to a person. It strips away illusions. It teaches patience through discomfort and humility through loss. And it forces conversations most people avoid until it is too late. Death, for Fox, is not an abstract fear waiting in the distance. It is a familiar presence, one he has acknowledged, studied, and ultimately made peace with. The remark about his funeral emerged not from bitterness, but from a lifetime spent under public scrutiny. Fox understands how spectacle works. He has seen how grief in Hollywood can turn into performance, how cameras find the most famous face in the room, how attention drifts away from meaning toward image. In speaking about who he would prefer stayed away, he was drawing a boundary, a final one. He was imagining a moment meant to be quiet and sincere, and asking a simple question most people never ask out loud. Who is really there for me, and who is just there to be seen? What makes this revelation resonate so deeply is the contrast between the life Fox once lived and the reality he now inhabits. There was a time when his name alone could open a movie, when exhaustion came from success rather than survival. That version of life vanished the moment a small twitch in his hand signaled something far more ominous. Since then, every achievement, every appearance, every smile has been earned against resistance. Living with Parkinson's is not a single tragedy, but a long series of quiet losses. Control, balance, simplicity, independence. Each one slips away slowly, forcing a recalibration of identity. And yet, Fox never allowed the disease to define him publicly as a victim. Instead, he reframed his struggle as purpose. He transformed personal suffering into collective action, turning his diagnosis into one of the most powerful research movements in modern medicine. But behind that public strength exists a private understanding that life narrows as it goes on. The circle becomes smaller. The noise fades. What remains is not fame, not legacy, but presence. Who sits beside you when there is nothing left to offer in return? That is the emotional core behind his words about death. Fox does not want a farewell crowded with obligation or celebrity. He does not want whispered conversations about who attended or what they wore. He wants something rare in the world that made him famous. Silence, honesty, familiar faces who knew him before the tremors, and those who stayed after they became impossible to ignore. In that sense, his funeral is not about the end of life, but about the final affirmation of how it was lived. For someone who has spent decades being watched, Fox's greatest wish is not to be observed but understood. His humor about mortality is not denial. It is acceptance shaped by experience. After 33 years of living with a disease that never stops taking, he has learned that dignity is not found in control over the body, but in control over meaning. And perhaps that is why this simple, unsettling comment about a funeral feels heavier than it should. Because it forces a question most of us are not ready to face. When everything else is gone, who would we want standing there? And who would we quietly hope stayed away? Long before illness entered his life, before tremors and medication schedules and careful choreography of movement, Michael J. Fox learned how to live as an outsider. Born into a military family, his childhood was shaped by constant relocation, new towns, new schools, and the quiet pressure of always having to adapt. Stability was never guaranteed. Each move meant starting over, learning how to read people quickly, discovering how to fit in without roots. That early transience left a mark. It sharpened his instincts, taught him timing, humor, and emotional intelligence long before he ever stepped onto a set. Being the new kid forces you to observe, and observation would later become one of his greatest strengths as an actor. From an early age, Fox understood that charm could be a survival tool. He was small in stature, youthful in appearance, and rarely the obvious choice for authority or dominance. Instead, he leaned into speed, wit, and precision. Comedy became his entry point, not because he wanted to be funny, but because humor disarmed people. It created connection. By his mid-teens, that instinct hardened into conviction. At 15, he made a decision most people would never dare to make, dropping out of high school to pursue acting full-time. It was not rebellion for the sake of ego. It was clarity. He knew what he wanted, even if the path toward it was uncertain and unforgiving. The early years were defined by scarcity. Los Angeles offered opportunity, but little comfort. Fox lived cheaply, worked constantly, and accepted rejection as routine. Auditions blurred together. Small roles came and went. Success, when it finally arrived, did not feel inevitable. It felt accidental, fragile, something that could disappear at any moment. That awareness never left him. Even when his career exploded, even when his face became globally recognizable through Family Ties and then immortalized through Back to the Future, Fox carried himself with a kind of urgency. He worked harder than necessary, slept less than he should have, and treated each opportunity as though it might be the last. That mindset shaped both his professional ascent and his private vulnerability. Fame arrived quickly and loudly, but Fox did not have the emotional infrastructure to slow down. In the mid-1980s, he was everywhere at once, filming television by day, movies by night, surviving on adrenaline and ambition. The world saw success. He felt exhaustion, and exhaustion, over time, becomes dangerous. It masks warning signs. It convinces you that limits are imaginary. When his body began to signal distress years later, his first instinct was not fear, but denial. He had trained himself to push through discomfort. Parkinson's did not announce itself dramatically at first. It whispered. The diagnosis at 29 was not only a medical rupture, but an existential one. Fox had built his identity around motion, speed, and control. Parkinson's attacks those very foundations. Tremors, rigidity, unpredictability. It is a disease that challenges not only the body, but the self-image. For someone whose career depended on precision, the implications were devastating. Yet Fox did not collapse publicly. He compartmentalized. He hid. For 7 years, he told almost no one outside his immediate circle. The secrecy was not cowardice. It was strategy. Hollywood is not gentle with weakness, and Fox understood that once an actor is perceived as unreliable, the door closes quietly and permanently. During those hidden years, his marriage became the axis around which everything turned. Tracy Pollan was not merely supportive. She was stabilizing. While Fox performed health for the outside world, she witnessed the reality behind closed doors. The uncertainty, the fear. The nights shaped by medication schedules and internal bargaining. Their relationship deepened under pressure rather than fracturing. Parenthood followed, not as an escape, but as grounding. His children gave him a future worth protecting even as his body began to betray him. At the same time, Fox's relationship with Hollywood subtly changed. He remained respected, admired, welcomed, but distance crept in, not through cruelty, but through structure. Projects ended. Cast dispersed. Familiar faces faded from daily life. This is the unspoken truth of the industry. Proximity creates intimacy, and when proximity disappears, so often does the relationship. Fox noticed who stayed in contact and who did not. He noticed who treated him as a person rather than a symbol. These observations accumulated quietly, shaping his understanding of what connection really means. When he finally revealed his diagnosis publicly in 1998, the response was overwhelming, but it also marked a transition. He was no longer simply an actor. He became a figure of resilience, an advocate, a spokesperson. While that role brought purpose, it also created another layer of public expectation. Courage became part of his brand. Optimism became something people looked to him for. Yet beneath that narrative, the disease continued its steady progression. Falls became more frequent, surgeries more common, losses more tangible. The distance between public perception and private reality widened. It is from this long accumulation of experience that Fox's reflections on death and funerals emerge. They are not impulsive thoughts. They are the result of decades spent distinguishing between appearance and substance, between presence and performance. He has lived long enough to know that not all attention is love, and not all attendance is loyalty. The friendships that endured were quiet, unglamorous, consistent. The ones that faded did so without drama, simply revealing the truth of circumstance. In that light, his desire for a small, intimate farewell is not morbid. It is logical. It reflects a man who has already said goodbye to many versions of himself, and who now understands that meaning is not measured by numbers, but by sincerity. His past, shaped by movement and ambition, has narrowed into something clearer. And in that clarity, Fox has learned that legacy is not who shows up at the end, but who never left along the way. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic collapse or public unraveling. It crept in quietly, disguised as endurance. By the mid-1990s, Michael J. Fox was living two parallel lives that rarely touched. On camera, he was sharp, fast, effortlessly controlled, delivering dialogue with the same precision that had made him famous. Off camera, his body was beginning to disobey him in ways that could no longer be ignored. Tremors intensified. Stiffness lingered longer each morning. Simple movements required calculation. Yet the greater burden was not physical. It was the constant vigilance required to appear unchanged. Working on Spin City demanded speed and physical presence. The role was relentless, built on timing and movement, the very things Parkinson's slowly erodes. Fox adjusted instinctively. He had shaking hands in pockets. He leaned against furniture to steady himself. He learned how to enter a room already moving so stiffness looked intentional. Medication became a form of choreography, doses timed precisely to ensure functional hours during filming. Between takes, when the cameras stopped, the illusion often collapsed. Moments of stillness exposed what motion had concealed. Alcohol entered this period not as recklessness, but as coping. Fox has spoken openly about how drinking dulled anxiety and softened fear, how it created temporary distance from the awareness that his body was slipping beyond his control. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. He remained professional, reliable, productive. Inside, however, he was fragmenting. Addiction does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as relief. Those closest to him noticed changes. Co-stars saw tremors between takes. Crew members sensed tension beneath the jokes. Yet Fox deflected concern with humor, a skill he had mastered long before fame. Humor was armor. It kept questions at bay. It allowed him to maintain control over the narrative, even as the truth pressed harder against the edges of daily life. The longer he hid, the heavier the secrecy became. Silence turned into pressure. At home, the disease reshaped everything. Parenthood brought joy, but also sharpened fear. Fox worried not only about his career, but about the future he might not physically be able to provide. Parkinson's does not progress predictably. There is no clear timeline, only uncertainty. Good days and bad days blur together. Plans feel provisional. The future becomes something negotiated day by day rather than envisioned years ahead. This constant uncertainty strains even the strongest relationships. Yet his marriage endured because it was rooted in honesty where the outside world received illusion. By 1998, the weight of secrecy became unsustainable. Hiding the disease demanded more energy than living with it openly. Fox reached a moment of reckoning, not driven by collapse, but by clarity. He understood that maintaining the facade was costing him time, health, and authenticity. When he finally chose to speak publicly, it was not an act of surrender. It was an act of reclamation. Naming the disease allowed him to reclaim ownership of his life from fear. The public reaction defied his worst expectations. Instead of rejection, there was compassion. Instead of pity, there was respect. For many, Fox's disclosure transformed him from a nostalgic figure into something deeper. He became proof that vulnerability did not erase dignity, that honesty could coexist with strength. Yet this new role carried its own complexities. Visibility brought responsibility. His illness was no longer private. It became symbolic, representative, discussed, analyzed. Fox understood that by speaking, he had shifted how the world would see him forever. Leaving Spin City marked another emotional rupture. The series had been a refuge, a place where routine and familiarity provided stability. Stepping away meant acknowledging limits he had long resisted. The farewell was emotional, not because of career loss alone, but because it symbolized the end of a phase of denial. From that point forward, Parkinson's was no longer something to hide from professional life. It was part of the equation. The years that followed were marked by contradiction. Fox continued acting in guest roles, often portraying characters dealing with illness, sometimes versions of himself. These performances were not acts of self-exploitation. They were attempts to integrate reality into art, to normalize what had once felt unspeakable. At the same time, his physical condition continued to deteriorate. Falls became frequent. Injuries accumulated. Surgeries interrupted progress. Recovery cycles grew longer. Each setback reminded him that adaptation, not resistance, was now the governing principle of his life. It was during this long middle stretch, neither beginning nor end, that Fox's understanding of people sharpened. Illness reveals patterns quickly. Some individuals step closer, offering quiet consistency. Others retreat, uncomfortable with prolonged vulnerability. This is rarely malicious. People are drawn to energy, momentum, possibility. Chronic illness disrupts those dynamics. Fox learned to recognize the difference between compassion and curiosity, between loyalty and proximity. He learned which friendships were rooted in history and which had depended on convenience. The entertainment industry, for all its warmth on the surface, moves forward relentlessly. New faces replace old ones. Attention shifts. Relevance becomes conditional. Fox watched this process unfold without resentment, but not without awareness. He had lived long enough inside the system to understand its mechanics. Fame, he realized, is not a reliable measure of connection. Applause fades quickly. What remains is who checks in when nothing is being promoted, who shows up without an audience. This gradual narrowing of his social world was not entirely painful. There was relief in clarity. Expectations simplified. The noise receded. Life slowed, whether he wanted it to or not. And within that slower rhythm, Fox began to think differently about endings. Not in dramatic terms, but in practical ones. What would matter at the end of a life defined by visibility? Who would belong in that final quiet room? His reflections on death did not emerge from despair, but from long observation. Parkinson's teaches patience through repetition. Each day demands acceptance of limits. Over time, acceptance turns into discernment. Fox learned to separate what he owed the public from what he owed himself. He understood that while audiences had shared in his journey, they did not own its conclusion. This is the emotional groundwork beneath his comments about funerals. They are not jokes floating in isolation. They are the product of decades spent watching how attention behaves around suffering, how celebrity can distort moments meant to be human. Fox has endured enough public narratives to know that grief can become spectacle if left unchecked. In wanting something small and sincere at the end, he is reclaiming a space the industry rarely allows its stars. Illness did not make Fox pessimistic. It made him selective. It taught him that time is not measured by length, but by depth. That presence matters more than performance. That silence, when shared with the right people, carries more meaning than applause ever could. And as his body continued to change, these lessons settled into conviction. By the time Fox began speaking openly about mortality, the fear that once defined the diagnosis had transformed into something quieter. Acceptance did not mean resignation. It meant alignment. His life, once propelled by speed and ambition, had slowed into reflection. And in that reflection, he discovered a truth few people arrive at willingly. The end of life does not need an audience. It needs honesty. The consequences of living openly with a progressive disease do not arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, reshaping identity, relationships, and daily life in ways that are often invisible to the outside world. For Michael J. Fox, the decision to step into the light with his diagnosis did not bring closure. It brought exposure. Compassion followed, but so did expectation. He became a symbol of courage, an emblem of optimism, a face people turned to when they needed reassurance that suffering could still produce meaning. Carrying that role required strength of a different kind, one that demanded emotional discipline even on days when his body refused cooperation. Physically, the disease tightened its grip. Balance became unreliable. Walking turned cautious. Falls were no longer rare accidents, but recurring threats. Bones broke. Surgeries interrupted routines. Recovery became an ongoing negotiation rather than a destination. Each injury carried not just pain, but a reminder that progress would never be linear. The body could improve temporarily, then regress without warning. Planning became tentative. Independence became conditional. Tasks most people complete without thought required concentration, patience, and sometimes assistance. The psychological toll of this gradual erosion was profound. Parkinson's does not only alter movement. It reshapes mood, sleep, cognition. Fatigue settled in not as tiredness, but as heaviness. Anxiety arrived quietly, often masked by humor. Depression hovered at the edges, restrained but persistent. Fox has spoken about how medication itself became a double-edged sword, offering relief while introducing new complications. Dyskinesia replaced tremors. Calm moments were bought at the cost of unpredictable motion. Every solution carried consequences. Socially, the disease reorganized his world. Invitations became fewer, not out of rejection, but uncertainty. People did not always know how to behave around prolonged illness. Some feared saying the wrong thing. Others avoided discomfort altogether. The shrinking of his social circle was gradual and revealing. Friends who remained did so without spectacle. They adapted to his pace, accepted cancellations, understood silence. Those who drifted away did so quietly, without confrontation. This narrowing was painful at first, then clarifying. Family life absorbed much of the impact. Parenthood brought joy, but also fear. Fox worried about becoming a burden, about the memories his children would carry, about the balance between protecting them and preparing them for reality. He remained present, attentive, involved, even as energy waned. His children did not know him only as a public figure battling illness. They knew him as a father navigating limitations with honesty. That distinction mattered. It grounded him. It reminded him that legacy begins at home, long before the world assigns meaning. Public reaction, while overwhelmingly supportive, carried its own weight. Applause can be isolating when it replaces listening. Praise can feel hollow when it does not acknowledge difficulty. Fox became accustomed to hearing how inspiring he was, even on days when inspiration fell out of reach. The disconnect between public narrative and private experience widened. Strength, as others defined it, did not always align with how he felt. Yet he continued forward, aware that withdrawing entirely would erase opportunities to help others facing the same diagnosis. Advocacy transformed his struggle into impact. Research funding accelerated. Awareness expanded. Conversations once whispered became mainstream. Still, progress in medicine is slow, and hope must coexist with patience. For Fox, this meant living in a state of permanent anticipation, waiting for breakthroughs, waiting for stability, waiting for answers that might never arrive. Over time, waiting itself became a condition to manage. The accumulation of these consequences reshaped how Fox viewed time. The future stopped being a distant horizon and became a series of manageable intervals. Good hours mattered more than good days. Energy was allocated carefully. Commitments were weighed not by desire, but by cost. This recalibration extended to emotional investment. He became selective with attention, careful with obligations, protective of peace. The world, once expansive, narrowed into something quieter and more deliberate. It was within this narrowed space that his thoughts about endings grew clearer. Illness teaches the difference between noise and meaning. It reveals how quickly attention can shift, how easily suffering can become content. Fox watched as stories about his health circulated, often stripped of nuance, simplified into headlines. He saw how narratives can overshadow individuals, how public curiosity can intrude on private pain. These observations informed his desire for control over at least one moment that would not be interpreted or reframed. The idea of a funeral, for him, became symbolic, not as an event, but as a statement. He did not want his final moment to echo the same patterns he had witnessed throughout his life. No hierarchy of importance based on fame. No obligation masquerading as respect. No spectacle masquerading as love. He wanted the consequence of his life to be measured not by attendance, but by sincerity. Emotionally, this realization brought calm. Acceptance settled where fear once lived. Death, long treated as an enemy, softened into inevitability. For someone who has lived with uncertainty for decades, certainty carries relief. Fox did not romanticize the end, but neither did he dread it. He understood that the body would eventually rest, even if it resisted peace along the way. The broader consequence of his journey lies not in triumph over disease, but in adaptation to it. He did not conquer Parkinson's. He coexisted with it. He adjusted his expectations, revised his identity, and redefined success. Each concession carried loss, but also clarity. The world shrank, but meaning deepened. By the time Fox spoke candidly about death, he was not retreating from life. He was articulating its boundaries. He had already lived through countless endings, careers paused, abilities surrendered, versions of himself quietly retired. In that context, a funeral is simply another boundary, another moment requiring intention. The true impact of his illness is not found in headlines or speeches, but in the subtle reshaping of values. What once mattered loudly now matters quietly. What once seemed essential has fallen away. What remains is presence, honesty, and the people willing to sit in silence without needing explanation. And in that silence, Fox has found something that illness could not take from him: peace. There are stories that never reach interviews, moments that do not translate well into sound bites, fragments of life that exist only in passing glances and unspoken understanding. For Michael J. Fox, these quieter chapters became increasingly important as the disease progressed. While the public saw courage and advocacy, the private reality was shaped by routines, small negotiations, and an ongoing effort to preserve dignity in spaces where no one was watching. Mornings often began with calculation. How steady were his hands today? How responsive were his legs? Which medication window offered the clearest hours? These questions formed a daily inventory, quietly answered before the world even noticed he was awake. There were days when the simplest actions required focus that bordered on meditation. Buttoning a shirt, holding a cup without spilling, walking across a room without misjudging distance. None of these moments were dramatic, yet each carried emotional weight. They were reminders that independence is not lost in one moment, but surrendered piece by piece. In those private hours, humor sometimes failed. Jokes did not always arrive on command. Optimism, so often attributed to him publicly, had to be rebuilt each day rather than assumed. There were nights when sleep refused cooperation, when stiffness and restlessness coexisted, leaving his body exhausted before the day even began. Fatigue was not simply physical. It was mental, emotional, cumulative. The effort required to remain composed, engaged, and present demanded reserves that illness steadily depleted. Visitors who came without expectation noticed these shifts first. Close friends learned when to speak and when silence was kinder. They learned to slow their pace, to match his rhythm rather than pull him toward theirs. Some friendships deepened in this space, growing quieter but more resilient. Others faltered, not from lack of care, but from discomfort with prolonged vulnerability. Chronic illness does not offer the relief of resolution. It lingers. It repeats. It asks people to stay when novelty has long worn off. Within his home, the disease altered dynamics in subtle ways. Conversations adapted. Plans became flexible by necessity. Family life learned to accommodate unpredictability without centering it. There were moments of grief, not always spoken aloud, for the father he once imagined being and the activities he could no longer share as freely. Yet there was also gratitude for what remained. Presence became the metric. Attention replaced activity. Time spent together, even in stillness, gained meaning precisely because it was limited. Fox often reflected on the contrast between how he was perceived and how he felt. Public appearances required preparation that extended far beyond wardrobe or speech. Energy had to be conserved days in advance. Recovery followed afterward. Each appearance was a choice weighed carefully, not for exposure, but for purpose. He learned to say no without apology, understanding that availability was no longer infinite. This selectivity extended to relationships. Obligation lost its power. Authenticity gained it. There were moments of frustration that never made headlines. Moments when his body refused cooperation at inopportune times. Moments when independence slipped unexpectedly, forcing reliance on others. Accepting help was not intuitive. It challenged an identity built on self-sufficiency. Over time, however, acceptance replaced resistance. Assistance became collaboration rather than defeat. This shift did not come easily, but it brought relief. Behind the scenes of advocacy work, Fox immersed himself in detail. He asked questions not as a celebrity, but as someone whose future depended on answers. Research meetings were not symbolic. They were personal. Hope was not abstract. It was urgent. Yet he also learned to manage expectations. Progress in science moves slowly. Setbacks are common. Optimism required realism to remain sustainable. There were private conversations with others living with Parkinson's that never reached public forums. Shared experiences created bonds unmediated by fame. In those exchanges, Fox was not an icon. He was a peer. These moments grounded him, reminding him that while his platform was unique, his struggle was shared. The disease equalizes in unexpected ways. Titles matter less. Appearances matter less. What matters is understanding. As years passed, Fox noticed a subtle shift in how he related to time. The urgency of youth softened into intention. He no longer chased moments. He curated them. Meaning was found not in accumulation, but in attention. This shift informed his thoughts about death long before he spoke about it publicly. Mortality did not feel like a cliff approaching its speed. It felt like a horizon always present, shaping decisions quietly. The idea of a funeral entered these reflections not as an endpoint, but as a mirror. It reflected what he valued now, not what once defined him. He imagined a room without pretense, without performance, without the hum of obligation. He imagined faces that required no explanation, no introduction. People who had witnessed decline without turning away. people who understood silence as presence rather than absence. This vision was not exclusionary. It was intentional. After decades of living within systems that reward visibility, Fox sought something radically simple, a moment untouched by hierarchy or expectation, a space where grief could exist without choreography, where remembrance would not compete with attention. These quieter stories, the ones rarely told, are what give context to his words about who he would rather not see there. They are not rooted in judgment, but in discernment shaped by experience. They reflect a man who has already let go of much, and who now protects what remains with care. Illness did not strip Fox of meaning. It refined it. It taught him that connection is measured by consistency, not intensity. That love is revealed over time, not in moments of spectacle, and that the most important witnesses to a life are often those least visible to the world. In the end, these silent chapters may never be fully known. They're carried in memory, in routine, in the quiet adjustments that define daily survival. But they're the foundation upon which his later reflections rest. Without them, his words about endings would sound provocative. With them, they sound honest. As the years passed, the meaning of achievement quietly shifted. Success was no longer measured by roles accepted or projects completed, but by balance maintained and days endured with dignity intact. What once felt like momentum became something else entirely, a careful equilibrium between effort and preservation. In that space, Michael J. Fox began to see his life not as a story of interruption, but as one of transformation shaped by constraint. There is a particular clarity that arrives when ambition can no longer outrun limitation. Illness narrows the field of possibilities, but it also sharpens focus. What remains after so much has been stripped away carries weight. Fox's legacy, once anchored in cultural moments and unforgettable performances, gradually evolved into something less visible and more enduring. It became defined by consistency rather than spectacle, by presence rather than productivity. He came to understand that resilience is often misunderstood. It is not constant optimism or relentless forward motion. It is adaptation. It is the willingness to reimagine identity without clinging to outdated versions of self. Over time, Fox stopped resisting the changes his body imposed and instead redirected his energy toward what remained within reach. Voice replaced movement. Intention replaced speed. Influence replaced appearance. In this quieter phase of life, reflection became unavoidable. Mortality was no longer a theoretical concept waiting somewhere in the future. It was a companion that shaped daily decisions. It did not bring despair. It brought proportion. Fear softened when weighed against gratitude. Loss became contextualized by what had been lived, not by what was no longer possible. The idea of legacy emerged differently through this lens. Legacy was no longer about being remembered by many, but being known by few. It was no longer about permanence, but impact. Fox recognized that stories endure not because they are loud, but because they are carried forward by those who live them alongside you. In that sense, legacy is relational. It exists in memory, behavior, and quiet influence rather than monuments or headlines. Illness forced Fox to confront the limits of control, but also revealed the depth of agency still available to him. He could not command his body, but he could shape meaning. He could not dictate outcomes, but he could choose response. This distinction became foundational to how he understood his remaining years. Acceptance did not mean passivity. It meant alignment with reality rather than resistance to it. As his public appearances became fewer, their purpose grew clearer. Each moment spent in front of others was intentional, anchored in substance rather than obligation. He no longer participated in the cycle of constant visibility. Silence became restorative rather than threatening. Absence, once feared in an industry that equates relevance with presence, transformed into peace. The disease continued its slow progression, but it no longer defined the narrative. Instead, it served as context a frame rather than the subject. Fox spoke less about what Parkinson's had taken and more about what it had clarified. Time gained texture. Relationships gained depth. The noise of expectation receded, leaving space for genuine connection. This clarity extended to how he imagined the end of life. Death was no longer an event to be dramatized or feared. It was a boundary like so many others he had already crossed. He did not seek control over the moment itself, only over its meaning. He wanted an ending consistent with how he had learned to live, stripped of performance and excess. In contemplating mortality, Fox articulated something rarely acknowledged, that the final chapter of a life does not need validation. It does not require witnesses beyond those who truly belong. After decades of being observed, assessed, and interpreted, the desire for privacy became not withdrawal, but completion, a return to simplicity. There is courage in facing decline without romanticizing it. Fox never pretended that acceptance erased difficulty. Pain remained, frustration remained, but they no longer consumed him. Perspective diluted their power. The long arc of his life revealed that meaning does not reside in uninterrupted success, but in response to interruption. In this way, illness became an unchosen teacher. It dismantled illusions while offering insight. It demanded patience and rewarded honesty. It forced the kind of introspection that many people avoid until circumstances leave no alternative. Fox emerged from this process not unchanged but refined. His legacy, viewed through this lens, is not confined to art or advocacy alone. It is embedded in the way he navigated loss without surrendering agency, in the way he confronted limitation without bitterness, in the way he allowed vulnerability to coexist with strength. These are lessons not easily summarized, but deeply felt. As he moved further into what he once described as the later stretch of life, Fox carried himself with a quiet steadiness. There was no urgency to prove, no need to persuade. What mattered had already been identified. What had not had fallen away naturally. In the end, the story is not about how much time remains, but about how that time is inhabited. Fox's journey suggests that a life shaped by illness can still be whole, still be meaningful, still be complete. Not because it avoids suffering, but because it integrates it into understanding. And perhaps that is the most enduring inheritance he leaves behind. Not a narrative of triumph over disease, but an example of coexistence with it. A reminder that dignity is not found in control, but in clarity. And that even as the body weakens, the capacity for meaning can deepen right up to the final quiet moment. As the story settles into its final quiet, what remains is not spectacle, but stillness. After decades of movement, recognition, and relentless public attention, Michael J. Fox has arrived at a place few people reach willingly. A place where meaning no longer needs amplification. Where life is no longer something to be proven, but something to be acknowledged. There's a misconception that talking about death signals surrender. In Fox's case, it signals clarity. He has lived long enough inside uncertainty to recognize that fear loses power when it is named. The body may weaken, but intention does not have to. His reflections on the end are not confessions of despair, but statements of authorship. After years of having his narrative interpreted by others, he is choosing the final tone himself. What he asks for is disarmingly simple. No performance, no obligation, no hierarchy of importance, just presence. In a culture trained to measure worth by attendance and attention, that request feels almost radical. It challenges the assumption that more is always better, that visibility equals value. Fox's life has taught him otherwise. Illness stripped away excess, leaving only what endured without effort. Those who truly belong do not need invitations. They are already there. They have been there through tremors and silence, through canceled plans and quiet mornings, through moments when progress stalled and patience wore thin. These are not relationships built on nostalgia or convenience. They are built on time shared honestly. And that honesty, more than fame or achievement, is what Fox wishes to honor at the end. There is dignity in wanting a small room rather than a crowded hall. There is intention in choosing intimacy over spectacle. Fox understands how quickly meaning can be diluted when moments become events. He has seen how grief can turn into narrative, how presence can become proof. In resisting that, he is protecting something fragile and rare: authentic remembrance. As his public appearances become fewer, his influence has not diminished. It has simply changed form. Influence no longer arrives through visibility, but through example. Through the way he speaks about limitation without bitterness. Through the way he acknowledges loss without letting it eclipse gratitude. Through the way he allows vulnerability to exist without apology. These choices ripple outward quietly, shaping how others understand their own struggles. The end of life, as Fox envisions it, is not a climax. It is a return to simplicity, to truth without performance, to connection without expectation. In many ways, it mirrors the values illness taught him along the way. That what matters most rarely announces itself loudly. That presence outweighs productivity. That being seen is not the same as being known. There is also a profound generosity in his openness. By speaking candidly about death, he gives others permission to think about their own. Not morbidly, but honestly. He invites reflection rather than fear. He reframes mortality not as a failure of the body, but as a boundary that gives life proportion. Without an ending, meaning loses shape. Fox's journey reminds us that legacy is not constructed at the end. It accumulates quietly, through choices repeated over time, through how one responds when circumstances tighten, through what one protects when options narrow. His legacy does not rest solely in film history or research milestones. It lives in the way he modeled coexistence with uncertainty, and in the way he refused to let suffering dictate his values. As the years continue to pass, Fox remains present in a way that feels intentional rather than performative. He no longer needs to outrun time or prove resilience. What he offers now is perspective, a reminder that a life touched by illness can still be complete. That acceptance does not diminish strength. That peace is not the absence of struggle, but the alignment of meaning with reality. When the final moment eventually arrives, it will not erase the decades that came before it. It will not reduce a life to a single ending. It will simply close a long conversation between ambition and acceptance, movement and stillness, visibility and truth. And in that closing, Fox asks only for sincerity. His story leaves us with a question that lingers after the words fade. When the noise recedes and the audience disappears, who remains? Who knows us without needing explanation? Who would we want standing quietly beside us, not because they should be there, but because they have always been? That question does not demand an answer today, but it asks us to listen, to notice, to consider what we are building toward without waiting for the end to define it. And perhaps, in that consideration, lies the most meaningful legacy of all.